The sky had not been blue in a long while. It hung low and bruised, a perpetual bruise of copper and ash that made the sun look like a distant ember. Light came through like a threat, harsh, hot, and thin enough that it did more to highlight the ruin than to warm it. Whatever weather used to be, seasons, moderation, mercy, had been traded away. In its place was an endless sequence of extremes. Heat that baked the soil to glass, storms that arrived like fists, and a silence afterward that smelled of burned paper and old engines. Cities I knew as steady things were now uncanny landscapes. The downtown I walked through once, with its glass towers and humming transit lines, had become a canyon of broken facades. Office buildings tilted like leaning teeth. Plazas were littered with rusted benches and shopping carts half buried in dust. Streets you could map by heart were folded into new geographies, collapsed overpasses, sinkholes where garages used to sit, malls opened like wounded animals. Riverfronts had retreated into memory. Promenades fell into crackling, salt-scarred beds where weeds withered mid-bloom. Rural places told similar stories in different languages. Fields once green with wheat now wore a salty crust, the topsoil blown away in a handful of seasons. Irrigation ditches were dry scars. Old barns stood with their faces peeled away, exposing the skeleton of a life once organized around planting and harvest. Forests burned in patterns that didn't match any regular fire season, whole stands collapsing in a single, black breath, leaving behind pillars of white ash that moved when the wind let them. Water, the simplest of human needs, had become the most complicated. Rivers no longer ran predictable courses. Reservoirs looked like pockmarked moons. Wells that had fed towns for generations were found empty or fouled by things our grandparents would not have named. Rain, when it came, was suspect. Acidic on some days, a thin chemical mist on others. The first showers after a storm were the most dangerous, carrying whatever had been pulled down from the sky. People learned to collect water like contraband. In black market jerrycans, in buried cisterns, in boiled, filtered batches that tasted faintly of survival. Governance unraveled quietly, not in dramatic coups but in attrition. Police beats thinned. Municipal services were first reduced, then rerouted, then stopped. In some places, officials left behind their badges and their last bit of authority, and in others they hardened into petty warlords who turned ration queues into a source of power. National networks blinked. Emergency broadcasts thinned to static. The institutions that once convened in ordered committees became rumor and memory, a fading archive of protocols and papers that no longer applied to a world where fuel, water, and clean air were the only measures of worth. What grew in the vacuum was raw and inventive. Survivor groups clustered around what resources they could defend. A pumped well that kept a roof garden alive, a solar array cobbled from scavenged panels, a mechanic's workshop that could keep an old generator breathing. These were the new municipalities, makeshift, democratic in some places, despotic in others. Names on doors changed to codes on boards. Greenhouse Watch, Nor's Well, East Gate. People traded skills like coin. A seamstress would fix a jacket in exchange for a week's share of water. An old chemist would teach basic filtration for a ration of fuel. Rogue factions and scavenger bands learned quickly that violence could be an efficient strategy. Raiders moved on motorcycles patched with plate armor, or in faded vans that had once been courier vehicles. They struck under cover of dust storms, slipping between communities like bad weather. Predatory groups took what they needed and left rules burned into fences. Messages in skull and crossbones paint, empty spaces where families had been. But there were also the salvage crews who came through with a different rhythm, respectful, trading for parts, leaving behind seeds or tools rather than bullets. Trust was measured in small acts and in the absence of violence. Institutions that refused to die entirely did so by shrinking into functions that still mattered. A handful of clinics operated on volunteer rotas, issuing antibiotic doses from hoarded vials. Libraries transformed into seed banks and instruction hubs. Schools, where they opened at all, taught children to read bird patterns as well as letters. Older infrastructures survived in pieces. A radio tower still broadcast a faint, crackling schedule. A water treatment plant limped along on a jury-rigged engine, and a rotating team of volunteers. In the hollow places, faith organizations turned into mutual aid groups, and scrap yards turned into engineering workshops that might, if enough stubbornness and luck aligned, keep a community running for another winter. The human landscape had contracted and grown more watchful. Streets that once saw morning commuters were now checkpoints. Courtyards that once held celebrations were now places to barter and broadcast. Neighbors learned to speak in signals, the three-snap code that meant safe, the white cloth hung from a window that meant water trade. Children learned survival as grammar, how to tie a water bladder, how to read the sky for storms, how to listen long and silent to the radio for voices that were still there. Anxiety lived in the margins of everything. People moved with calculation, how many liters to carry for each mile, what hours to walk when heat was least cruel, whether to answer a knock at the door. Uncertainty was not merely a feeling but an operational parameter. Shelters might get overrun, promised aid convoys might not arrive, and flooding could return to a place that had spent years drying. The future, if you could call it that, folded into a series of immediate decisions. And yet, in the thin cracks between despair and calculation, small stubbornness persisted. Someone painted a mural on a burned wall. A child found a stubborn dandelion in a sidewalk crack. A group of elders taught seeds how to remember summer. Those acts did not erase the damage. They did something quieter. They held a shape against the ruin, a human shape that refused to give up entirely. In a world where landmarks were unrecognizable and institutions limped, that refusal was itself an address worth tuning to. My name is Miles Harrington. Names matter less now. There's something you reach for when you want to remember the rhythm of who you were. But I keep mine because it fits the cadence of the broadcasts I send out at dawn and dusk. People have a way of attaching to voices. It's how I've stayed tethered to the world that keeps falling away. I used to read meters and mend transformers. My life was measured in volts and schedules. A job shift, a lunch break, a walk through a neighborhood that smelled of bread and gasoline. That life folded quietly, like a map you don't need anymore. The grid failed in increments, a blown transformer here, a line down by wind there until entire neighborhoods no longer bothered to flick a switch. When the baker's ovens cooled and the transit stopped, the rest followed. It was not dramatic. It was attrition. Now my days are practice. Survival is a set of learned rituals I perform with the stiffness of someone who learned to pray out of habit. I wake before the light because the mornings are still the best time to move without burning. First, I check the generator, a battered beast that lives in the back shed, a jury-rigged thing of alternator parts and bartered capacitors. I pedal it when fuel runs low, and there are mornings when the pedals cry under my feet and the battery only clicks once before failing. I oil the chain. I tighten the cables. Routine keeps panic at bay. Water is the first accounting of the day. We keep a ledger. Water isn't merely consumed. It's allocated, inventoried, and negotiated. I know where the wet spots are, the places the ground clings a little to your boot, the small wells that still hold a grudging puddle. I can dig a shallow well in soil that looks dead and coax a few liters out of it with a hand pump. I can fashion a crude filter from layers of sand and activated charcoal, and I can build a solar still from plastic sheeting and a bowl. The taste is never clean, but it sustains. Food is ingenuity. We grow what we can in pockets. A roof garden in a broken greenhouse I stole the glass for, hanging pots rescued from an old restaurant, a compost heap made from carefully rationed kitchen waste. I've learned which seeds are stubborn and which betray you after one dry season. We rotate crops and baby them through heat spells under shade cloths, and the occasional bit of irrigation saved from last month's ration. Preserving is a religion. Smoking, fermenting, sealing in wax where jars exist, drying tomatoes in twisted ovens made from corrugated metal. Heat taught me to move less and think more. Heat steals strength faster than hunger. We plan our errands like military maneuvers, avoiding the sun's worst hours, traveling by night when the air cools enough to breathe. Movement now costs water, not time. Every mile requires a ledger entry. Liters in, liters out. It makes you calculate kindness as if it were a commodity. I am a radio man because it was the only tool I had left that could bring people together without moving them into danger. The transmitter is a clunky thing, half married to an old truck battery and a tangle of salvaged copper. I wrap it in plastic when the dust storms come and sing to it like one might to an old dog. My broadcasts are practical and small. Schedules, weather warnings, barter notices, and the occasional human voice clipped and patched together over static. I read names people send in and hold silent minutes for those who don't respond. People say the broadcasts are morbid, others say they're lifelines. Both are true. What keeps me going is not some heroic idea. It's responsibility mostly, a promise made in a cracked voice to strangers that if they tune in, I'll be there. If someone finds water, if a clinic opens for an hour, if a caravan is on the move, it helps when that information makes it into the air. There's a pattern to survival that goes beyond muscle and rationing. Information is oxygen. Without it, we make worse choices and suffocate in avoidable ways. There's also a softer thing, the need for connection. When nights are long and the wind carries the smell of burned plastic, a human voice is a small hospital. People call with stories, with requests, with recipes for fixing a pump or the location of a hidden cache. I keep a small index in a torn notebook. Names and the codes we use to verify identity, the times people usually check in, who has the sewing skills and who has the scavenged antibiotics. I trade knowledge for parts and kindness for labor. Those trades are not always equal, but they keep a web alive. Loss is a constant, not a single event. I carry it like a piece of coal in my pocket that warms sometimes and occasionally singes. I lost a woman who used to fold my shirts the way you fold promises. She left when the ration queues started bristling and never returned. I lost a child's small hand once in the corridor of what used to be a grocery store. We searched for days and found only scuffed shoes and a hat. There are pictures, clipped into plastic sleeves, that I can't look at for long. They tug at an ache that makes my hands useless for soldering or the radio's microphone. Guilt is a frequent visitor. There are nights when I broadcast and then realize I used the last strips of battery for the microphone when a neighbor needed light to stitch a wound. I have to justify choices I made because someone else needed fuel to move to safety. Sometimes the ledger of moral choices is heavier than the ledger of supplies. There are small cruelties I've embraced because they are efficient. I can sleep with one eye open, and I have learned to trust only those who come with vetted names or who answer the call and response key we use now. We developed a code after a convoy was robbed at a supposed humanitarian drop. Now anyone wanting aid must identify with 2 words and the sound of 3 knocks in a rhythm we recognize. It sounds mechanical and cold, but it saves lives. My hands are full of practical knowledge. I can splice wire in the dark, fashion a solar tracker from scrap metal, and build a battery cell from zinc and copper plates when nothing else is at hand. I know how to clean a wound with boiled water and a tincture of alcohol from a scavenged bottle. I can jury-rig a stove to burn wood more cleanly so that less smoke chokes the children. I teach others Layla, who mends jackets and makes bread when she can, and Amir, a boy of 12 who runs errands and is learning to read weather patterns and to recognize a storm cell by the smell of the air. We have small governance where I live, a council of 7 who decide ration priorities, patrol rotations, and trade agreements. It's not perfect. It's messy and human. People argue, tempers flare. But it's better than a gun pointing at a line of bowed heads. We debate every major action because decisions reverberate. One misallocated leader can mean a life. Sometimes the council chooses to help a caravan and spends 6 weeks water. Sometimes those choices gain us allies who teach us how to desalinate, and sometimes they leave us gutted. Hope is not one thing. It's a sequence of actions that refuse to normalize surrender. It is teaching a child to graft tomato stems. It is fixing a pump so a roof garden survives another summer. It is broadcasting a weather warning that lets people put tarps in place. Hope is also grief converted into motion, channeling loss into improving the next ration distribution, patching what is torn so someone else need not suffer. I am not naive. I have seen the worst of what desperation makes of people. I have watched a man who had nothing take a child's ration and run. I have heard the short, ugly laughter of those who justify violence with the logic of scarcity. But I have also seen courage. A woman who traded her only sweater for a week's water to feed a neighbor's baby. A mechanic who stayed behind to teach 3 apprentices how to keep a diesel running even when offered a bag of seeds to leave with. There is tenderness in small things. A kettle that has boiled for decades on the same cracked stove. The smell of bread Layla manages to coax from old flour. The way Amir folds a note into the radio's feed for a friend who lives 3 roofs away. These are anchors. They tether us to a future that is not promised but still possible. I tell these things on my broadcasts not to be heroic, but to be honest. People need authenticity more than rhetoric. I end each show with a simple line: "You are heard." It is a small sentence, and sometimes I'm barely sure it's true. But when someone replies and says, "I heard you, Miles," the ledger balances for a minute. It makes the nights shorter. It makes the generator hum mean something beyond noise. This is who I am. A man who fixes radios, ration ledgers, and the fragile human habit of believing there is a tomorrow. I survive because others depend on the voice I carry. I keep going because the smallest acts, a stitched wound, a water filter, a broadcast at dusk, have a way of adding up. They are not grand. They are not enough to rebuild a fallen grid or restore a river, but they are the thinnest bridge across that wide, broken place between despair and the next breath. The Missouri River in my childhood was a ribbon of silver that moved like an artery through the land. Now it is a seam of cracked clay and sun-bleached bones of trees. That image isn't melodrama. It's the arithmetic of collapse. The crisis we live in is not a single monster with a name. It is a stack of slow, relentless failures that feed each other until the whole system tips. For us, it began with droughts that kept coming back faster and hotter, then fires that tore through what remained of the green, and then the things we had counted on, pumps, pipelines, the clinics, began to fail in ways no one had planned for. Drought isn't polite. It doesn't announce itself and then leave. It takes in layers. First the surface dries, topsoil blows away in windstorms, and what's left can barely hold a seed. Then the groundwater drops as everyone drills deeper to get what's left. Aquifers compress and don't refill on the timetable our grandparents thought permanent. We started digging wells where wells never existed, and each one that worked was a mailbox of joy for a week and a debtor's note the next. Every liter pumped lowers the next well's chances. Heat is a multiplier. Hotter air holds more moisture. That sounds like it should mean more rain until you remember where that moisture came from. Evapotranspiration rises, plants sweat more than they photosynthesize. And clouds move in different paths because the jet stream that used to sit like a slow river of air learned new patterns. Storms arrive early, late, or not at all. When they do arrive, they can be violent. Convective systems that throw hail and lightning and then leave the ground scorched. The pattern is chaotic, and chaos is expensive when every decision costs water and food. Wildfires change their grammar. In older times, a fire would consume a patch and then stop. Now we get firestorms. Columns of heat so intense they create their own weather. Updrafts that pull embers a dozen kilometers and set new blazes. Those fire-generated thunderstorms, pyrocumulonimbus, bring lightning and ash that fall like snowfall on a world that can't clear it. The ash coats solar panels, clogs filters, and makes roofs unsafe. We learn to stop treating fires as singular events. We learn to treat them as traveling disasters that leap and multiply. When old nuclear facilities failed in the chaos that followed infrastructure collapse, their failure didn't explode like in films. It leaked slowly, contamination in silt, in fish, in wellheads. Radiological contamination is a ghost, invisible, patient, and stubborn, and it forced us to declare whole basins unsafe and to test water and soil before trusting them. Not every place is contaminated, but when your only water source is downstream of a failed plant, you cannot rely on faith. You must test, filter, and sometimes walk farther than you wish to find anything drinkable. Those physical forces shaped human behavior. Resources grew scarce and scarcity rewired incentives. When a well pumps clean water, you either gather neighbors to share and defend it, or you hide it and hope someone else's conscience is sturdier than your fear. And sometimes conscience breaks. Raider gangs learn to listen to radio schedules and watch roads during dust storms. They use the very networks we set up for help to time ambushes. In other cases, survivors organized like small municipalities, rotating patrols, ration committees, and barter markets. Both models are human responses. One is collective, one is extractive. Survival got harder each day because the margins thinned. Where we once had redundancy, multiple wells for a town, spare fuel for a generator, we now had single points of failure. A pump goes down, and 100 people must decide who walks to get water today and who waits. A generator dies, and medicine refrigeration is lost. A single sick child can drain a community's antibiotic supply. Systems that were designed with redundancy assumed steady supply chains. When those chains fractured, the math changed, and so did the calculus of risk. Our resource limits are blunt and immediate. Water is the first constraint. We ration, and rationing is a pressure you can feel in the bones. A healthy adult can get by for a day or two without water in cool conditions. But in our heat, the safe minimum pushes up. We capture what we can: buried cisterns, jerry cans collected in caravans, and the small wet spots you coax out of a dry wash with a shovel and patience. The practical techniques matter, because good technique can stretch a cache from a few days into a week, but luck and geography still dominate the ledger. Food has become a choreography of preservation. Industrial farms failed when irrigation became untenable. Fields turned into salt flats. Where we could, we converted lawns and rooftops into gardens and grew heirloom varieties that resist drought. We teach grafting, seed saving, and staggered planting. We smoke meat and dry fruit. A tin of canned food is now equivalent to a month's worth of trade in some corridors. Fuel is another bottleneck. Diesel keeps generators alive and pumps moving. Without it, even a functional pump is a memory. Medicine is volatile. Antibiotics, vaccines, and painkillers have finite supplies and fragile storage needs. A single refrigeration failure can make a clinic's entire stock worthless. This is where knowledge becomes a weapon and a tender. On the air, I give instructions not because I want to play doctor or engineer, but because I've watched people die for want of a simple technique. So here's the middle distance practical stuff I broadcast often. Water testing and treatment. Never drink standing water without testing. If it smells of oil or has an iridescent sheen, don't touch it. If it smells of rot, don't touch it. If you have no test strips, let it settle. Clear water settles. Cloudy water might clear with time but may still contain microbes. Always filter first through a cloth to remove particulate matter, then through layers. Coarse gravel, coarse sand, fine sand, and then activated charcoal if you have it. After filtering, boil the water. Boiling is the simplest microbiological kill step. Bring it to a rolling boil for at least a full minute when possible. If you have no fuel, use solar pasteurization. Place water in clear PET bottles on a reflective surface in full sun for several hours. If the bottles get hot and the day is clear, this can reduce pathogens. Remember that boiling and solar methods do not remove chemical contamination. For that, charcoal is your friend because it absorbs many organic chemicals, but not salts or heavy metals. If you suspect radiological contamination or heavy metals, you must find an alternative source. Downstream of a known failure is not the place to take chances. Build a solar still. Dig a shallow pit. Place a container in the center. Cover the pit with a sheet of clear plastic, and weight the plastic at the center with a small rock so condensed water runs into the container. Use a small bowl or cup as your collector. The still takes hours but can produce small amounts of drinkable water from saline or gray water in an emergency. Charcoal filter construction. Burn wood down to charcoal, not completely to ash. Crush it to coarse granules. Layer it above sand and gravel in a narrow container like a cut plastic bottle, and pour water through slowly. Charcoal removes tastes and many organic contaminants, but does not make chemically poisoned water safe. Battery and generator care. Don't fully discharge batteries. Keep them topped when possible. Clean contacts with a dry brush and a bit of vinegar if corrosion appears, then dry thoroughly. Use a charge controller with solar panels to prevent overcharging. Inverters waste energy. Use DC loads directly when you can. If fuel is scarce, conserve it for essential pumps and medical refrigeration. Prefer hand or pedal-powered options for small tasks. Heat and shelter. Insulate living spaces with reflective barriers to reduce daytime heating. Vent at night when temperatures drop. Shade cloth can reduce solar load dramatically for rooftop gardens. Use thermal mass barrels of water painted dark and shaded to moderate temperature swings. Wound care and antibiotics. Clean wounds with boiled and cooled water, and then with an alcohol-based antiseptic. Apply pressure to stop bleeding and use clean bandages. Antibiotics are precious. Use them when a wound shows systemic signs: fever, spreading redness, or severe infection. Teaching wound cleaning and sterile technique is one of the best community investments. The science behind these tips is simple, blunt stuff. Remove particles, kill microbes, remove organics, and if possible, avoid contaminated sources. But practical science must operate inside a scarcity envelope. You will likely lack ideal filters, test strips, or fuel. That's why local knowledge, who upstream filters well, whose roof collects cleaner water, where the old rain cisterns are, matters. The human incidents are as varied as the seasons. We had an Allied convoy once, a crew of engineers who came with a windmill blade they'd salvaged from an abandoned quarry and the know-how to set it. They taught us to tune a generator to the windmill's alternator, and for 3 months our pump ran without diesel. Those months were golden. We planted on a schedule, and the roof garden produced enough to trade. Then raiders learned about our windmill. They came in the blue dawn with ropes and greed. We fought them off, but they took a blade and a lithium battery. The cost of defending a windmill became obvious. You either collectivize defense across villages, or you accept that anything that produces will attract predators. We've had betrayals that were worse because of the pretense of help. A medical convoy arrived with promises of vaccines. People queued for days to get them. The organizers left at dusk with the spare fuel and 3 generators, and we later found their tattoos from a known band of raiders. That is why we changed the code. Now anyone offering aid must carry pre-vetted tokens and identify only in halves. You give one name, we give another. If the names match the ledger, we proceed. It's not a perfect system, but systems create friction that slows predation. The crisis pulls at ethics as much as supplies. We choose who to save sometimes, and in those choices we define ourselves. There are nights I dream of a line of names on a ledger, and imagine erasing a dozen to save one life. That terror sits in my chest and is why I broadcast. The more people have information, the fewer desperate gambles they'll take. Knowledge, distributed, is our best defense against the arithmetic of scarcity. This part of the story is bleak because it must be. But the crisis also shows unanticipated things. innovation in backyards, old engineers teaching kids how to wind copper and create coils, and communities sharing seed vaults like holy relics. We trade not only food and water but the practical sciences of survival. We teach distillation and battery maintenance as if they were liturgy. That's how we keep going, by turning knowledge into action, and by teaching the next person the exact way to tie a water bladder so it doesn't leak when you need it most. The crisis is both environmental and moral. The storms and the droughts are the stage. People on that stage make the choices that determine whether we fall apart or stitch ourselves into something that can last. I broadcast these facts because a clear, calm set of steps can save a life more reliably than hope alone. But the radio also carries stories. Reports of a new hand-operated desalination rig up the coast, or a group that has managed a small aquifer restoration using bucket brigades. Those stories are the other kind of fuel, not diesel but courage. And in a world where fuel is counted in teaspoons, courage is currency. They came in waves that tasted of old rubber and bad wind. At first the shortage was a quiet thing we measured in hours. 1 more hour for the pump, 1 less hour for the radio. Then it turned into lists and ledgers that bled red ink. The generator that used to cough to life for 4 hours a day now managed maybe an hour and a half if I coaxed it with fresh oil and conservative revs. Batteries drooped like tired dogs at dusk. A single deep discharge meant days of silence. The roof garden shrank from a bounty to rationed leaves. Flour that had been tucked away in a corrugated box for an emergency, 20 kilograms, became an accounting line. 1 kilogram per week if we stretched it and avoided pastries. We did the math until it made our hands shake. It is one thing to know scarcity on paper. It is another to wake up and find that the ledger you trusted has gone blank. We found an unexplained leak in a cistern that morning. Half the stored water gone, seeped into the ground as if the earth were swallowing kindness. Whoever took it had done so quietly, with gloves, leaving footprints that trailed into the dust and vanished. That kind of theft is heavier than the loss itself. It collapses trust. Raids became more organized, less opportunistic. The first time we saw the black-striped vans, they looked like a bad joke, advertised on scraps of vinyl, repurposed, plated with mesh. Later we learned they called themselves the Red Line. They weren't amateurs with masks. They had discipline, scouts, and a code that made them efficient predators. They watched, listened, and then struck when the weather gave them cover. Dust storms were their best camouflage. When the sky went to grain, they moved like ghosts on the periphery. We fortified what we could. The council, 7 of us with too many opinions and not enough arms, decided to set patrols and create noise traps. Strings of cans on thin wires that alerted us if someone crossed a perimeter at night. We dug trenches and piled sandbags behind the solar array. We shared a ration of bullets and made them count. We taught the children silence, how to sleep without a murmur, how to not let curiosity be a signal. We taught them the difference between an animal's footfall and a boot. Those were teachers' lessons we never expected. Still, a patrol surprised a scouting party one night. I was awake because the radio had been picking up a strange carrier wave, an old boat channel from way back, and I wanted to log it. I heard the snap of the cans, then a muffled shout. Layla grabbed the lamp and we went out. The scene was chaotic and quick. A man with a rag over his face raising a stolen flare, 3 others rushing a gate. Amir, he's 12 but moves like he's 12 seasons older, had one of the patrol sticks and took 2 quick swings. The raid lasted minutes but made dust into memory. They took a barrel of diesel and a bundle of blankets. A patrolman had his jaw broken. A woman who had taught songs to the children was shoved and hit her head. She's quiet now and afraid of open air. Those kinds of losses are not merely material. They change how you speak to neighbors, what you tell new arrivals, and whether you answer a knock at the door. We changed our protocols. Aid drops we used to announce over the air now go through a vetting process. The three-knock pattern was replaced by a four-step shibboleth which only someone vetted with a correct ledger key could answer. We stopped broadcasting specific times for our generator's longer runs. That secrecy kept us alive, but it also kept us small. So when a rumor came across the line, soft as a half-remembered lullaby and twice as hopeful, I almost didn't broadcast it. Rumors are bullets if flung carelessly. But it came with enough weight that silence felt worse than the risk. A traveler's account, a hand-drawn map, a muted audio clip of a woman crying into a receiver 10 nights ago saying, between sobs, "Blue well. 3 miles north of the broken wind farm. We pull clean water." The voice was brittle and scared, and when she signed off the carrier faltered. The message did not come with a ledger check. It came with a sound that made my chest tighten. A blue well. It sounded too good to be true. We had heard other names with the cadence of myth. North Harbor, the Springkeepers, the Greencloth, each one a story that kept men walking into traps or back into despair. Maybe it was a hoax, maybe a private spring someone wanted to protect. Still, the map the traveler sent showed an old drainage line and a tilted windmill symbol that we remembered from a satellite image years ago. If true, it would be a water source, not a trickle but a well that could be defended and shared. Hope in our line of work is dangerous. Announcing a source invites loans of faith and offers of knives. Hiding it keeps people thirsty. The council argued until voices frayed. Some said we must go. Others said we must keep the secret and guard what we had. I listened and felt the ledger balance tilt between duty and prudence. What is broadcast is not neutral. It becomes action. I spent nights trying to verify. I reached out to a chain of radial contacts, old scavenger crews, a salvage band we knew 3 passes over, asking if anyone could corroborate the blue well. A man called Farid, who runs a salvage crew, answered after 20 minutes of silence and coughing. He said they passed a patched convoy 2 days prior and overheard a woman with a cracked voice speak the name before they were spooked by a smokescreen. Farid's word is not law, but it is closer to a footnote than rumor. The weight shifted. At the same time, the environment kept punishing us. The storms changed for the worse, black, low, and acidic. They came one after the other with no forgiving break. After each, the days were hotter, and the nights held a metallic tang that clung to clothing. The solar array needed cleaning more often. The panels lost capacity in minutes under layers of ash. The pedal generator now needed longer pedaling sessions. My knees remembered the ache of hours under the crank. Food yields dropped. The roof garden gave us 2 harvests last year. This year, 1 middling yield and then a stubborn pest that ate leaves in the dark. The pressure of scarcity makes people measure risk differently. A man can rationalize taking a risk for water when his child's lips are blue. I do not judge that calculation. I've made one myself, but the more people made those calculations, the more the world shrank inward. The caravan lanes closed when banditry increased. Trade forums, where people would leave messages and trade tokens, were burned and replaced by smaller, more secure drops. The overhead of trust rose in cost. We prepared for the blue well in secret. The council decided to send a small reconnaissance team first. 2 of our strongest, Hassan, who can fix a pump with duct tape and prayer, and Myra, whose hands can find leaks like a bloodhound smells a trail. I volunteered to go because I felt like a coward if I did not. Layla gave me a sealed packet of biscuits, pressed into my palm like a blessing. Amir insisted on coming until I made him promise to stay. He folded his fingers into mine and swore he would watch the radio if I left. The travel was a study in caution. You move differently when you carry the possibility of hope. The path north was a patchwork of burned fields and collapsed pylons. We avoided the main roads because the red line liked to use them. We moved in a ragged line at dawn, the sky already a bruised thinness, and used hand signals. The land looked like someone had gone through with a blunt instrument. Trees stumped at torso height, fields caked in salt, houses collapsed into themselves. When we reached the coordinates, we found the wind farm skeletons, tall bones of white that groaned in soft winds. One blade lay half buried like the broken fin of a submarine. Around that blade were fresh tracks and a small camp of overturned tarps. We moved slow, testing the wind, ears open. Under one tarp was a small drum of water, covered, about half full, a smudge of algae on the rim. Nearby, lines of footprints indicated more people had come through recently. The ground showed signs of a pit to the east faint, but there. Someone had dug. Then the confrontation. A man stepped out from the far side with a rifle slung. He said he was from the Blue Well. His hands were clean and his eyes were wary. He introduced himself as Jalil and said they were protecting a small spring. He offered to show us, but not before he asked for proof we weren't raiders. Proof in our world is names, codes, and sometimes scars. We gave him half of a ledger name and he gave back a token. The exchange was ceremonial and thin. He led us along a contour and pointed to a dip in the earth. There was water pooled in a shallow basin with a ring of stones. It did not look like much until Hassan dipped his hand in and drew up a cup. He drank, and the expression on his face shifted: surprise, relief, disbelief. It tasted like water, slightly cool, slightly metallic, not tainted. Jalil explained they had tapped an aquifer pocket sealed by clay and were carefully managing output. They had a small solar pump and a sand charcoal filtration system. It was enough for a few dozen people if rationed. The discovery was a wedge. It widened fault lines and demanded decisions. Jalil said they could not share openly. Their perimeter was thin and their nights were restless. They had enough trust to show two outsiders, but not enough to invite a caravan. His voice was threaded with exhaustion. He asked a question that would become the pivot of our lives. If we share, will you help us guard it? Will you trade seeds and labor for our water? The choice was moral and logistical. If we integrated the Blue Well into our network, we could stabilize a corridor of supply. If we used it solely to replenish our cisterns and then left, it would remain vulnerable. If we exposed it too soon, it would be overrun. I could see the ledger balancing in my head. Leaders in, leaders out, guards needed per shift, extra grain to trade. Responsibility crowded like a pressure front. Back at our compound, the council debated until midnight oil sputtered out. Some argued to hide the location and siphon a secret share. Some wanted to form a coalition, pooling defense with two neighboring communities. Others suggested moving our entire population closer and fortifying the site. Each choice had costs: fuel, exposure, manpower, and above all, moral risk. I sat and thought of the woman who had told the radio about the Blue Well with tears in her voice. She had sounded desperate and honest. Maybe she had been one of the people who protected it. Maybe she had been swept away. The ambiguity gnawed. My internal struggle was loud and often lonely. Trust has become a currency, and I had to decide whether to spend it. I had been taught to broadcast to connect people, to spread information so that fewer mistakes would be made out of ignorance. But this was a rare case where broadcasting could be an act of violence, where the very act of telling could overwrite a fragile equilibrium and invite predators with ropes and greed. In the end, we decided to form a shared defense pact with two nearby communities who had reliable patrols and a small stock of smoked fish they were willing to trade. We would send rotating guards and establish a covert trade schedule. We would not broadcast coordinates until the well's defenses could be strengthened. It felt like the right compromise, an exercise in mutual trust that could break us or make us. The weeks that followed were a montage of work and fear. Hassan and I spent long hours patching the windmill blades and improving the filtration. Myra taught a dozen of us how to maintain the solar pump's controller. Layla organized the bread shifts. Twice a week, we baked loaves for men on guard duty. Amir learned to map the sky and would whistle if he saw distant dust columns forming. His whistle became our alert. The red line tested us more than once, probing raids, empty vans, a cunning night where they tried to pose as traders with forged tokens. Each time the code we'd made and the watch we'd set bought us minutes, and minutes are the currency of survival. Tension does not resolve neatly. It accumulates like dust in the corners of rooms. We won a month's worth of water security and a grimmer sense that each success drew a line on a map in someone else's head. The blue well bought us breathing room, but it also made us a node on a map someone else might want to redraw with fire. Every evening I would sit by the radio and read the names of the people who checked in, small acts of liturgy. I still ended the broadcast with the same line, "You are heard." The phrase felt heavier now, layered with secrets and obligations. I had to mean it. If I could not stand by what I announced, then the air itself would become a place of lies. The rising action is not a single storm or a single raid. It is the accumulation of choices and consequences, of trust extended and betrayed, of water found and then defended at the cost of sleep. It is the slow watching of a world that asks you to decide how many lives you can share and how many you must protect. I learned that courage often looks like small logistics. A new latch welded on a gate, a shift schedule posted in careful handwriting, a forward code scrawled in a ledger. And so we moved forward more careful, a little wiser, more tired. The world kept testing our arithmetic. The red line did not stop, the storms did not ease, and the garden still needed shade cloth stitched back together. But for the first time in months, when I checked the ledger, the water line read, stable, not abundant, not safe, but stable. That small margin felt like a promise. It was not salvation. It was a next step, and in the calculus of our lives, the next step is often all we can ask for. The sky broke without a warning that felt human. A bruise of cloud rolling up from the south, until the whole world folded under a single shade. It came like the closing of a fist, low, black and fast, the kind of storm that made birds go silent mid-flight. We had seen bad storms before. We had learned to batten the tarps and wrap the panels and keep the transmitter in plastic. This one felt different. It smelled like metal and the inside of old trucks. It tasted of iron on the tongue. We were still in the wind farm when it hit, 2 months after the blue well was first opened to our pact. The place had become an ugly, tender note of life. Solar panels patched with tin and tape, a patched windmill that squeaked at dusk, a line of barrels and a careful filtration table with sand and charcoal. We had built a fence of corrugated steel and sharpened beams. We had also built a schedule, watches that shifted every 6 hours, a small clinic tent, a message board with ledger keys. For a while, it worked. For a while, we were a thing other than hunger and fear. The red line moved like weather. They timed things, watched radio feeds, tested codes. They had attempted probing raids before and retreated when the perimeter noise traps and the guard dogs did what they were supposed to do. We had lost blankets and a barrel of diesel in those older nights, but we were learning counters, decoys, traps, false tokens. We learned the arithmetic of attrition, give up small things to keep the whole. The storm changed the arithmetic. It started at noon. The sky, which had been that thin copper color, folded into a wall that made our own skin feel foreign. Ash came first, fine, powdery, like flour but hot. The solar panels dimmed within minutes as the ash coated them. The wind picked up like an argument, and then, from the lee of the turbines, we heard the sound of engines. A dozen, maybe more, hidden in the storm's gibbering cover. They were being cautious. They were using the storm as a veil. We realized it at once. Raiders were coming during the storm when our visibility and our watch would be crippled. I tasted bile because we had been sloppy. The red line had been probing farther than usual. They had learned our routines. They had put a price on our water and decided to collect. We had minutes. Decisions in minutes are terrible things. They are narrower than sin. They force you to choose who you are in a single heartbeat. Hassan grabbed the radio first, mouth a thin line. "We can't notify the coalition," he said. "The signal will bleed. They'll hear and come. But the noise will also draw everyone's attention. We can't risk a caravan getting trapped out in that." Myra was already checking the pump, hands sure and fast. Layla had a bucket of bread to hand out to the guards. Amir stood at the line with his whistle and his 12-year-old concentration, eyes big and face set like a child who'd practiced courage in secret. I thought about broadcasting the truth, screaming the coordinates to everyone and asking for help. It was what I had always done. Information spread like light. Light keeps fear honest. But the storm would scatter that light like shattered glass. If I broadcasted, the signal would reach farther and attract others, raiders who would pick up the scent, caravans who might wedge themselves into the open like prey. The radio tower itself, once considered sacred, could become a beacon. I could warn, but the warning might be a flare. There was another option, meaner but perhaps cleaner. We could trigger the old decoy plan, set up a false perimeter and use the transmitter to send a single badly modulated call sign, a bait. In the static, it would look like one of our scheduled runs and might draw the red line to a different coordinate, away from the well. But doing that would require diverting the battery power away from the pump and the clinic, switching life support to a lure. It would also place someone at the decoy point, a person who would have to stand in the open when the raiders came. It would be a human shield of choice. Old promises crowd the mind in those moments. I remembered the woman who had cried into a receiver months ago, tears making the voice brittle as glass. Blew well. Her voice had been an offering. She had trusted my air. I had promised quietly to protect it. The idea of broadcasting and letting the well be picked over felt like breaking that promise. The idea of sending someone to be a bait felt like choosing a life to barter for many. Either was violence of a sort. I stood, hands raw from the cold of the storm and the grit of the day, and thought about radios and the debts they create. The transmitter is an extension of me now. It is the nearest thing to a priest's pulpit that I have left. I could use it to save or to damn. I had to decide. I picked the meaner, quieter option. Prepare the decoy, I said. The words left my mouth and felt like a stone. Hassan, Myra, you'll set it up. Layla, you and I will cut the feed to the pump and move the battery to the decoy rig. Amir, stay at the well and keep watch. If they come to the well, you blow the whistle and move to the fallback. Do you hear me? His nod was the nod of children and of soldiers, the one that confirms you will listen even if you don't remember why. He pressed his small palm into mine and squeezed like someone who wanted to fix me with a promise of return. We moved like a machine when the storm granted us hiding. Ash clung to the air, and every breath felt like tearing. Myra and Hassan ran, bodies low, to the old turbine base where we'd hidden spare batteries and a false antenna. They worked fast, metal clanging, smoke in their lungs. Layla and I cut the connections to the primary pump and moved what we could. A battered truck battery, a hand-cranked alternator, a rusted microphone that I had come to love because of the voices it carried. We did not waste words. We prepared a small rig, a transmitter tuned to our band but modulated to sound like an incoming supply run, canned chaff, and a prearranged password they might accept. Everything about the plan made my stomach harden. We were not only lying to a predator, we were inviting them somewhere we hoped they weren't. We were creating a place for them to expend their greed so our people could keep the water. It was theater. We hoped theater would be persuasive. I split the final choices into actions I could touch. I wrote a short broadcast, a lure, the kind of message an opportunistic group would act on. I loaded it with the right keys and the right cadence. I wrapped it in noise so it would sound casual, not desperate. Then I wrapped the real transmitter in oiled canvas and carried it like contraband toward the turbine base. My palms were filthy. The storm made the antenna bend and sing. At the decoy point, we set a simple trap. Noise traps reworked into trip triggers, pits covered with thin sheets, a line of bladed stakes we hoped would slow but not maim. We put out a flare in a place easily seen by someone skimming the dark. We left a single rusted jerry can to signify treasure. We left the battery warm and the transmitter singing a line of hope. Meanwhile, Amir sat at the well with 2 other guards. The water basin shivered with the storm's shaking. He watched the horizon. He He had the whistle I had given him the week before, a small metal thing I'd kept from an old bike, and he promised he would use it only once, the sharp call to summon every nearby defender if the well itself was assaulted. Then the engines came closer, swallowed into the storm. For a long minute nothing happened. Then the radio at the decoy cracked. They circled the false light at the rogue turbine, boots scuffing ash. The trip-traps sang sweetly. One of them stepped on a wire and a can fell into a pile, a sound like a can. A flare spat and died. Someone swore. The voice came closer to the transmitter. They tried the password and got a garbled response because the signal had been purposely mangled to appear like a remote outpost that had been damaged by storm. They thought the jig would be easy. It was messy, as most things are. The plan was not to kill but to delay. We wanted time to get the real battery hooked back into the pump, to keep that thin, life-giving flow moving. But in the chaos things unspooled. A man lunged for the battery box and stepped into a shallow pit we had dug to trip anyone moving fast. He fell, and an edge nicked his forearm. He screamed. The sound climbed like a bell into the storm and made a churning of fury among the raiders. They answered with sudden, bright violence. We had expected them to be patient, to probe for an hour and then leave. Instead, a group surged, pushing through ash like a wave. In the storm's gray, bullets glinted like teeth. The noise was everywhere. I saw Amir, 12 years old, shove a man who moved toward the well. He had a small stick, and he used it as if it were a sword. I saw Hassan meet a raider at the fence with a shovel like a hinge of doom. Myra's face was a hard thing. She moved with the calm of someone who had sewn a lot of wounds. The decoy had done its job enough to draw most of them away, but not all. Some had chosen speed over caution and had arrived straight at our perimeter. They wanted water and they were not inclined to leave empty-handed. There was a moment when everything slowed, a common hallucination in battle where every breath lengthens. I thought of the small shop where I used to buy batteries before the world stopped. I thought of the woman who had folded my shirts. I thought of the child I had failed to find in the grocery corridor. Memory is a strange thing that arrives when you are trying to choose life. A raider came at Myra with a knife. She moved like someone who had practiced giving away pain so others could live. She twisted, caught his wrist, and the knife skittered into the dust. The man cursed and reached for a gun. Hassan swung the shovel. There was a thud and then a silence like a blown ember. Amir's whistle cut the air, sharp, piercing. It sounded like a bell, and it sounded like an alarm. The whistle was a decision amplified. It meant no longer secrecy. It meant open call to any nearby allies. It meant we were no longer merely defending, we were summoning. For a moment I felt sick because the whistle would bring other humans into harm's way, and I had summoned them. But the whistle also had the effect we needed. It scattered the raiders who had been in the fence line and drew their attention to those who had not expected the call of neighbors. Figures moved in the storm, small shapes answering Amir's sound like bees to a hive. Our coalition had kept a promise. If one of us was under attack, the others would respond. They came running through the ash, the same ragged people who now owed us their lives. We fought for what felt like hours but was probably shorter. The red line had numbers and aggression. We had grit and home. Bullets hit corrugated steel and wood. Shadows leapt. At some point, a man with a bandana and a rifle moved toward the pump, and I realized he would take it if no one stopped him. If he took the pump, the well would die, and then everything we had done would be for nothing. I moved with the wrong kind of speed, the kind where you don't think and you just fill an action with everything you're made of. I ran toward him, legs burning and the world condensed into a single line, the man, the pump, and Amir watching from the fence. I dove and tackled him. The rifle skidded away. We rolled in ash and the man cursed and tried to pull free. He tasted of old tobacco and oil. We wrestled like children and like enemies. I could feel the shape of his hunger in his hands. There was a flash at the edge of my vision. Hassan and Myra together, forcing the rest back. Someone shouted my name. Another voice called for mercy and died out. The pump worker, the man I'd wrestled, looked at me then, and there was a human moment. He was not all monster. He had a child on the line back in a van someplace, he grunted, and he would do whatever it took. In that grunt was a mirror. I saw in him the calculation I had wrestled with hours earlier, a life for many. We were the same in the currency of scarcity. That recognition didn't make his actions right, but it humanized the choice. I made a choice in the dusty dirt with a stranger's hands around my shirt. I could have killed him. It would have been easy and final. I could have left him and let the pump be ripped out and our work undone. Instead, I found my breath, and I made the small, practical choice that would keep more people living. I disarmed him, bound his hands with a strip of canvas, and looked at the faces of the men who had come with him. They were tired, younger than I expected. They were angry and hungry and taught by a world that taught them to take. I chose to give them something worse than death, the possibility of a different account ledger. I told them through gritted teeth that if they left us alone and helped us repair what they tried to break, we might trade for fuel and bread. It was a gamble in language, and it was a gamble that needed trust. They spat and cursed, but they were tired and the storm had taken their advantage. We made a bargain, help fix the fence, take only a set ration, leave the pump and its schedule intact. They would sign with names and awkward ceremony, and take 5 men to listen to the rules. Some left cursing. Some stayed and helped begrudgingly. Necessity can be a teacher of humility. By dawn the storm had spent its rage and the field was a different thing. Ash on everything, tire tracks, and somehow a pump that still hummed. We had paid with bruises and a bloodied lip, and the knowledge that our secret had been pressed into someone else's memory. We had also paid with the knowledge that we could choose to be cruel or to be smart. We had chosen a messy compromise. I sat by the pump when the first clear water came up, a thin ribbon at first, then a fuller stream. People cheered in small, ragged sounds. It was not a party, only a relief measured in sipped cups. Amir came and sat on my knee, face smudged with coal and his own small exhaustion. He put his head against me like a bird finding a shoulder. I realized then the thing I had done at the microphone that night. I had made a call that was not simply a broadcast but a covenant. I would use the air to protect what needed protecting, even if the protection required lies and lures. I had crossed a line, and in doing so had anchored a promise not only to the Blue Well's guardians, but to the strangers who had helped defend it, and to the boy on my knee. The turning point was not one bullet or one fallen raider or even the storm. It was the choice to bind and bargain rather than to burn and sever. It was the decision to convert desperation into labor and to convert threat into a fragile transaction. It was also the price. We had to broadcast less and hide more, to build stronger fences and teach more children to whistle. The radio still hummed in my pack, but I had used it that night more as a tool of deception than of pure light. The radio was a priest and a liar, and I had to live with that. When the sun came up and began to bake the ash into a crust, I walked to the radio tent and put my hand on the warm metal of the transmitter. It had sent the bait and it had kept its sound. It had been part of the theater. I felt a strange kind of guilt and a strange kind of relief. We had survived the storm and the raid. We had kept the well. For the first time in months, the ledger's water line read not just stable but hopeful. But we had also learned that every hope has a cost, and every aid can be turned into a weapon. I knew, as I tightened a loose bolt on the generator, that the choice we had made would follow us like a shadow. The red line would remember the taste of the decoy, and the men we had bound would carry a different lesson into their own neighborhoods. That night I broadcast a small message, not a lure, not a ledger, but a line of fragile truth. This wash holds water. We held it for our children, not for conquest. It was not enough to make peace, but it was something. A voice in the static sounded back with a name I recognized, and for a moment the world felt less like a ledger and more like a choir. The storm had shifted the shape of things. We had survived it, but survival, I realized, was not a destination. It was a series of compromises and an inventory of what we were willing to exchange. privacy, secrecy, and pieces of our simple truth. I held a mirror close and thought of the woman who had first whispered blue well into the air. Somewhere, maybe, she was alive. Maybe she had been one of those who helped defend it. Maybe she had already left. We could not know. We could only do the next necessary thing. Repair the pump, bind the wounds, knit the fence tighter, teach the children to whistle a different call. The turning point had come and passed. It had reshaped us. The world outside the fishbone of our fence roared and baked, but inside there was a thin, stubborn thread of life worth defending. When the ash settled and the worst of the storm passed, the nights felt longer for reasons that had nothing to do with dark. The memory of the engine sounds, the flash of rifles, the shock of bodies against our fence, those things live in the muscles. They thread through sleep like a needle and pull at seams. In the small hours after the battle, I walked the perimeter and counted the repairs like prayers. Outcome is never neat. We kept the pump. We kept the blue well. That is the headline, simple and blunt. The pump hummed again after more hands and less sleep than any of us had planned, and the filter table produced water that tasted like cold metal and salvation. The inventory in the ledger shifted from deficit to cautious surplus. Liters for 3 days, then 4, then enough to send a crate of water to a neighboring compound in exchange for a watch rotation and 2 sacks of seed. The coalition we'd formed, fragile and imperfect, cemented itself in the trade of practical things, labor for leaders, watches for seeds, until it became not just a transaction but a kind of low-pressure alliance. That alliance bought us time, but the cost was not small. We bandaged the wounded. Hassan's jaw needed stitches. The woman who had been shoved in the raid suffered a concussion that left her quiet for a week. Some of the raiders who had stayed to work as part of the bargain left at dusk the next day with grudging nods, carrying parts of the fence they had helped mend. Others I watched at night with the same wary eyes I learned to keep on new faces. They were people wearing the logic of hunger like a uniform. A few men from the Red Line did not leave. They were bound and then offered a choice, help and an apprenticeship in exchange for turning away from organized raids. That decision sat like a stone in my chest. It was practical, maybe necessary, but it felt less like mercy and more like the only alternative that would not drown us. The community changed in small ways that mattered more than we expected. We established a formal rotation of guards that included representatives from each participating compound. We posted a careful schedule where formerly we had only shouted times across the yard. We held short meetings in the mornings, and in those meetings we told each other what we had seen and learned. Layla started a small class on mending and sewing that doubled as a place to teach children how to stitch torn ration bags into new sacks for seeds. Myra ran an engineering circle where we practiced fixing a pump in the dark. Amir grew quieter in ways that were not bad. The boy learned how to hold a whistle with a thumb over the hole until it was needed. He became the inhabitant of my quieter prayers. What I lost, internally, and what I gained are tangled. There is less room for illusions. The radio sits differently in my hands. Once it was an instrument of pure disclosure. Speak and the world hears and knowledge spreads. Now it is also a weapon and a veil. The bait I broadcast in the storm was a necessary deception. It bought lives. But the fact that I can spin a signal and cause men to move and die keeps me awake. The air I occupy is heavier. I move with the knowledge that my words have real consequence beyond comfort. Saying someone's name on the air can become both a blessing and a sentence. Guilt is a constant companion. I am haunted by the man I bound and spared, his ragged eyes, the way he coughed ash into the wind and said he had a child in a van. I think often of the calculus that drives a desperate man to violence. I do not excuse it, but I do try to understand it because understanding keeps me from repeating the same cycle of petty vengeance. We reached a bargain that night, labor and food for life. It was pragmatic. And in a world where the ledger tips lives into numbers, pragmatism can be mercy. The environmental ledger shifted too, but not in any way I would call hopeful in a large sense. The storm had been fierce, but it did not wash the earth clean. Ash settled into the soil and made some beds harder. Some seedlings we had patiently coaxed curled up and died in a day, and had to be replanted with new seeds from our ration stock. The solar panels that had survived needed more cleaning and fewer days of full sun. Panels lost efficiency. The wells we found are pockets. They are not rivers. Nature does not heal like a person. It heals in fits and starts, and often on timelines that humans cannot afford. Still, some small things returned. After a week, a scrub of green returned to a stretch near the wind farm where a tiny spring fed a ribbon that trickled shallowly between stones. It is not robust. It is not enough to restore the riverbeds or turn fields green. But it is water that did not exist before the storm, or at least not where we could reach it. Seedlings survived here in a way they had not in our rooftops. A moth I had not seen in months settled on a railing. These are not signs of a healed world. They are the small, stubborn acts of living things trying on new conditions. They give us data, indicators that pockets of regeneration might be possible if guarded and cultivated. Emotionally, I have changed. The man I once was, someone who believed in absolute openness and the sanctity of broadcast, has been tempered. I am sharper at the edges. I measure my words before I speak. I have learned to be tactical with truth without becoming a liar. That distinction is fragile but important. I have also learned the surprising elasticity of community, that people we thought rigid about their mistrust can learn to trade with strangers, that the boy who watched from the fence can learn to be brave without becoming cruel. I cannot say we have won. The red line still exists, and raids will reoccur. Humanity is adaptable in its worst habits as much as in its best. The blue well is a node on a map now. Maps get read, and being a node invites attention. Our defenses are better. Noise traps, false perimeters, a modest watch system. We have a small armory of improvised weapons and a clear set of rules about engagement. We also have a new protocol for new arrivals. Tokens shared among 2 communities. A 3-stage verification that requires names and local references. It is bureaucracy of survival, and it slows hunger's impulse toward violence. One surprising consequence is the way our moral calculus has shifted toward an ethic of repair. We used to hoard things because hoarding felt like survival. Now we hoard knowledge more than goods. We teach more apprentices how to spin wire, how to maintain the pump, how to splice connections when the contact corrodes. We hoard not only batteries but skills. That's a different kind of thrift. Invest in human capital because machines fail, but knowledge can be carried between hands and teach another pair. There are nights when I go to the radio tent and call names into the static, and the names answer back. Sometimes the replies are short and utilitarian, requests for parts or an offer of spare flour. Other times the calls are just voices, human and ragged, and they tell small stories. An old man who remembers the bank clock that used to chime in downtown called to tell me he'd seen green on a rooftop 3 districts over. A woman called to say she taught her granddaughter a song. Those voices are the quiet aftermath of the storm, not grand renewal, but the continuation of small human things. They keep me anchored. I have less faith in easy narratives. Heroism is not a single galvanizing moment. It is the everyday decision to fix a bolt, to bandage a wound, to teach a child to whistle a code. The turning point taught me that courage is often logistical. It is a matter of shifting a battery, redistributing watches, and training another pair of hands. These are aesthetic acts of survival and also moral ones. What we choose to protect, how we allocate risk. Looking ahead, we have a plan that balances the moral ledger as best we can. The pump will be guarded. We will expand the coalition to include 2 more communities willing to trade labor and seed. We will set up a rotating clinic schedule so the small refrigerator is never left unguarded, and vaccines, what little we can salvage, are used efficiently. We will train a small team to manage incursion events with a clear rule set. Minimize bloodshed, maximize bargaining. We will teach children to whistle differently depending on the time and the direction. We will catalog names. We will teach more people to solder. There is a humility now in the way I speak. I do not promise more than I can deliver. I tell people what I know and what I suspect and where to be cautious. On the air, I use the radio like a map and not a sermon. The ledger that matters is not only the count of liters and bullets. It is also the count of people who know how to keep a pump alive when I am gone. If I have any legacy to leave, it is not my broadcasts. It is the little engineering circle Myra runs, the sewing class Layla started, and Amir's new habit of tucking a spare whistle into his pocket and teaching other boys how to hold it without letting the sound scream. Hope in the aftermath is a modest thing. It is a water level that does not drop overnight. It is a fence that holds for another month. It is a day when we can give a neighbor some. When I go on the air now, I do so with a narrower, harder honesty. I tell people what I know and what I suspect. I avoid broadcasting precise locations unless it is absolutely necessary, and we have a plan for defense. I read names because names mean responsibility. I end the broadcast with the same line I began with years ago, but it has changed. When I say, "You are heard," I mean it in a different way. I am not promising rescue. I am promising that someone listens, that we will try to be a network where knowledge can travel, and by traveling, keep more people alive. My final plea is simple: teach the next person. It sounds pedestrian next to images of rivers and governments and large-scale engineering. But teaching one more person how to clean a filter, how to graft a stem, how to stitch a wound, these acts change more than one life. They change the ratio of survival in a community. When we spread skill and not just food, the community becomes more resilient than any stockpile. Stay careful and stay kind. The two are not mutually exclusive. Carefulness saves water and fuel. Kindness keeps people coming together instead of breaking apart. Where possible, make pacts that bind work to water, not violence to water. Where possible, invest in human capital. Where possible, teach a child how to solder a wire so the light can last another night. I do not know what will happen 5 years from now. I cannot promise rivers will return or that governments will mend their broken circuits. What I can testify to is this: there are mornings when the pump hums and a child drinks cool water. There are nights when the radio crackles and someone in the dark speaks and another voice answers. Those small exchanges are the stitches we need. So keep your hands busy. Mend the torn things. Teach and trade and guard. When you can, speak the names of those you protect. When you cannot, at least keep a ledger. When you hear the whistle, go if you are able. If you run the risk of speaking into the static, make the transmission count. For tonight, I will walk the perimeter, touch the warm metal of the transmitter, and listen for voices. I will write names into the ledger, and I will teach Amir how to splice a wire. I will mend the filter, check the pump, and then sit under the thin sky and count small, hard blessings. You are heard. Keep breathing. Keep teaching. Keep the next person alive. That is all I have to offer, and it is enough to keep us moving toward a dawn that will be different, quieter, and harder, but also perhaps ours.